think I was actually influenced quite a bit by the Ferris Bueller movie. I was about 19 years old when that movie came out.
I must be honest here. I love driving it. It is so choice. If you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. And greetings to all of you listening from places like Nantucket, Massachusetts, St. Paul, Minnesota, Rancho Mirage, California, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Bologna, Italy, home of Lamborghini, and Penzance, Cornwall, England. Thanks for joining me once again, and we're going to get right into it today, you guys. We're talking 50s Ferraris and Alfa Romeos and other cars with my guest, Dr. Gerald Alexander, a car collector of impeccable taste, and you'll see why. More about that shortly, but first, I have a special report for you on the 2024 Pikes Peak International Hillclimb with my buddy Ryan Bahrke. And you may remember Ryan because he's been on Horsepower Heritage before. He's the former co-host of the Steering Committee podcast. We did a crossover a few months ago. If you haven't heard that episode, check it out. But he's got a new project in the works, and we'll be talking about that shortly. But Ryan was boots on the ground this year at Pikes Peak, and you know that's an event that I have not yet attended. So it's on my bucket list, but I really want to hear Ryan's impressions. So Ryan, welcome to the show.
It's good to be back.
I am so glad we could put this together on short notice, Ryan, but you were there, and what a banner year for Pikes Peak, right? The weather really cooperated this time around. You never know, right? There can be fog and rain, but it was sunny skies and perfect dry conditions on the course.
Yeah, it really was. It was a beautiful weather year. You know, to your point, that doesn't always happen. In fact, I think most years it doesn't happen. I've tried to go to Pikes Peak, I think 3 times now. The first time a couple years ago, I woke up on the mountain with COVID, so that wasn't much fun. And I don't know how much you know about Pikes Peak, but depending on where you position yourself, you may be stuck up on the mountain until 7, 8, 9 at night, until all the cars are back down. So that was a miserable day spent. Last year, I guess I went to practice. It was rained out for the first time ever. So third time's the charm. Maurice was fortunate enough to go this year with media credentials, which is always fun. It makes you feel important. And took the whole thing in. You know, I had my buddy Dan Pillingen from out of town. We were down for what they call a fan fest on Friday. Before that, our friends at Porsche Colorado Springs have what they call the driver meet and greet, which is just a fantastic event. They've got such an amazing collection of cars themselves, but then they have a lot of the race cars. They have the drivers, you know, Popst and Lonnie Unser, and just all the big names, all the Porsche drivers especially are there. Food trucks and just a great time. And then so we went all in, and we went up the mountain at 1:30 the morning of the race, which was fun. I didn't sleep a bit. You approach the mountain, then you realize you see a sea of red lights, right? Red taillights in front of you. And you slowly get your way up the mountain. Eventually you get up and you decide where you want to park yourself. And when I tried this before, we went up to something called the Halfway Picnic Grounds, which is neat because you get to see the cars at speed. Some people like to go up to what they call Devil's Playground up near the top, which a lot of like Larry Chen always positions himself. You get these great sort of, you know, action shots of the cars and turns and things. A lot of the wrecks happen up there. We hung out at the start line this year, which we thought might be kind of fun because you get to wander the pits. You get to talk to some of the drivers. I'm fortunate enough to have gotten to know a couple of the drivers a little bit here, being a local in Colorado. You know, that's kind of where the excitement is. But Pikes Peak is a little different from most races, right? As you know, first off, it's not a race, it's a hill climb.
Right.
So it's one car at a time. I think about every 5 to 7 minutes, another car goes up. It's on a mountain, right? So there's no grandstand. There's no, there's not much in the way of facilities, right? But it is truly, you know, one of the spectacles in racing. I think it's a bucket list thing right up there with, you know, Le Mans or Indy 500 or any of these things. It's just the energy is palpable. That's a special kind of thing. You know, unfortunately at the start line, you basically see the cars launch and then that's it. Then you've got to watch it on the big screen until they finish. But I successfully completed, I guess, my first year as a spectator at Pikes Peak International Hillclimb. there's a whole thing you're supposed to say. It's the Pikes Peak International Hillclimb, brought to you by Gran Turismo and I think it's the Broadmoor or something. I screwed that up, but there's a whole thing you're supposed to say. Shout out to Lisa and the media team for putting on a wonderful event. But I've done a lot of talking. Sorry.
No, it's
I'm
fine.
Still wound up. It was a big deal.
Yeah, I would be too. Just so people know, Pikes Peak is 14,000 feet. It's a very precipitous climb on that road. And I don't know how many turns there are, Ryan. I don't know if you remember. It's like,
I don't offhand. It's a lot
on the entire course. But, in the 1930s, the first Ford V8s were running Pikes Peak, I think at about a 17-minute time. And this year, the winner, Romain Dumas, who's a French Le Mans winner, multiple sports car championship titles, the 24 Hours of Daytona, I think the Sebring. Anyway, he ran this year. He was the winner at a time of 8:53 and however many tenths. So from the 30s at 17 minutes in the first V8s that were really tackling the mountain to today, 8:53. Pretty amazing.
It really is. And it's such, for many reasons, it's a unique event. But of course, one of the many reasons is over the years, and this is the 102nd running. 102nd running. I mean, they've been doing this thing. I think maybe the only race they've been doing longer is Indy. One's one, one's number two. But one of the things that makes it unique is that over the years, the surface has changed. It used to be completely unpaved, and for many years it was half paved, half unpaved, and then several years ago now, and I don't think it was the decision of the Pikes Peak hill climb folks, but they paved the whole thing right all the way to the top. And so you've got that variation over the years. You've got one of the things that's really neat about Pikes Peak, Maurice. I'm just going to set my notes down here and just wrap, because it's a whole thing. It's a whole vibe, right? You've got everyone racing from or competing from homebrew folks who roll up with an old pickup truck, and a ratty car and a trailer to, people like Dumas in these fully, factory backed efforts, and then everything in between. A lot of local people, a lot of people who are doing it. And then their dad is there. Shout out to a pal of mine locally, Trevor Aweda, who's been on the show or who was on the steering committee, and his dad, who finished back to back with really great teams or times this year. You've got a diversity of cars. I can never quite capture or never quite understand the different categories. But you've got these open classes. So you've got very, very powerful cars. You've had ex-Indy cars run. You've got, more street-based cars that run. And then you've got these things like Romain Dumas was in with, these hypercars, these electric hypercars, right? And everything in between. And something else that makes it interesting, you alluded to the altitude. Even here in Denver, where I'm sitting, we're at supposedly 5280. I might be a little higher where my house is, but just so you have this baseline atmospheric power loss in an IC car. And then as you go up the mountain, it just gets worse and worse and worse. Johnny Lieberman, who participated a couple years ago in a GT4, ordinarily a pretty decently powerful car, talked about how at the top he's dealing with like 180 horsepower, and the car's barely moving. And so you've got all these variables. You've got the weather, right? It makes for a fascinating day. Unfortunately, it's not the easiest thing to spectate, right? Much like with rally racing, stage racing, or whatever, you often do a lot of walking, just to see a car for a few seconds as it flies by. But as a spectacle, as a thing, as just a unique, form of racing, it's really hard to beat.
Yeah, Pikes Peak is on an international scale, right? It's a signature American event, but it's as significant as Le Mans or Monaco or, you name it, Sebring. I just have a couple thoughts that I'm going to rattle off. One is that you mentioned Lonnie Unser, who is a great young female racing driver. And of course, the Unser family is like an American racing dynasty. The Unsers were the first to try to get up Pikes Peak as fast as they could on motorcycles in, I think, the early 1920s. And they've continued that tradition through 4 generations now. Remarkable. And Al Unser Jr. is her uncle. So that's cool. And then let's talk about Romain's ride, Romain Dumas. It was an F-150 Lightning EV super truck. And really doesn't look like a pickup truck. There's so much aero on this thing.
Yeah.
It's wild. But I think that shows you two things. Number one, the F-150 is Ford's flagship, right? The F-150 it's really Ford's most significant product, as I said, flagship. And it shows that they're doubling down on the EV stuff.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, and the EV thing is so interesting because, we hear a lot of whining about electric vehicles and electric, vehicle racing and race cars and all this, but you have a real advantage, on something like Pikes Peak, right? Not only do you have the traction advantage and, all the things you can do with individual motors and all that, but you have the altitude thing. And that's kind of what I was getting at before. I can't remember the last time the fastest car was an IC car. I think it's been a few years. I'd have to fact check myself. But again, this F-150, this electric truck, I mean, it was so much faster off the line than some of the other stuff, right? You have a real advantage in an electric car. And what's neat is Fred Veach, who's run this thing forever. He's competed himself. He's a legend. I ran into him down at Amelia Island earlier this year and talked with him for quite a while. There's a whole history, right, with Pikes Peak and the Broadmoor and this fellow, I think Penrose was his name, who started this hotel and his private zoo, which was turned into the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo down there, and started this race and all that. There's a whole thing, and Fred's really the torchbearer of that, and he knows everything about the race and who's participated in the different families and who owned the land that this is on before it became this and all that. And, one of the things he said is, electric vehicles are nothing new to Pikes Peak. And I want to say there was an electric vehicle like in the 20s that raced Pikes Peak. I could, again, need to fact check that, but it was many, many years ago, And so, it's always been this sort of this venue for experimentation, right? Where anything goes, right? You mentioned motorcycles, and motorcycles did run at Pikes Peak up until a few years ago. And unfortunately there was a tragic incident right at the finish, and they decided to not move forward with bikes. But, it's just, I don't even remember what your original question was, Maurice, but it's such a special thing in the history, to your point, the families that have run this for generations. I think you mentioned, Lonnie Unser, obviously Jeff Zwart, shout out to Jeff Zwart, who has an outsized presence, with Pikes Peak, who, he's just, we stayed in a hotel down in Colorado Springs and we saw this beautiful blue 911 Dakar, right? And then guess who pops out? Jeff Zwart, right? It's just, there's this level of accessibility, right, that goes along with this too. And I want to touch back or circle back on your comment about this being such an international thing. There's something about when something is in your backyard, you sort of take it for granted, right? There are a lot of things like that. And for, I think, a lot of people in Colorado, we take this for granted. We take the Pikes Peak hill climb for granted. When you walk around, the accents you hear, there are French people, there are Japanese people, right? Germans, Russians. It's just people from all over the world. This is a huge, huge deal, I think, to everyone but us who live here. Right. And so we need to change that. Like, this is this amazing thing, and it's in our backyard, and this amazing venue. I posted a reel to Instagram just with the views you see, it's I kind of struggle with why it's not a bigger deal here locally, but everyone else seems to get it, right? Because it is so special.
I think that's an excellent point. And just give people an idea. From Metro Denver, what kind of drive is it for us? If you're a spectator and you want to fly into DIA and go to Pikes Peak, what does that entail?
Sure. You'd fly into DIA, which is northeast of downtown, say 45 minutes into town. And then, Colorado Springs theoretically is only probably about an hour and 15 minutes. Of course, there was a guy in a motorcycle recently, you probably saw, that did it in 20 minutes or something, right? I think they caught him, but
bananas.
On paper, it's not that. Yeah. Crazy. On paper, it's not that far, but inevitably there's traffic and everything else. So, I would say door to door from DIA to the base of the mountains, probably a couple hours, right? And Colorado Springs is a very different city, for better and worse, than Denver. It's just the way it's sort of situated. It's very pretty and all that, a little more desert like, right? But just a gorgeous area. As far as the experience, Colorado Springs is not a big city, right? I think it's about half the size of Denver. But of course, plan ahead, because all the hotels are jacked up for the weekend, right?
It's just like Monterey Car Week, right? All the hotel prices get doubled
Not that bad, but same idea.
Right.
As someone who's planning a trip to Car Week right now, so I'm not sure I can afford it.
I know.
I can afford Pikes Peak, which is also a consideration, right? But are you just sort of curious about the kind of the spectator experience? Or?
Well, I mean, I guess what I was getting at is if somebody's listening and going, yeah, that sounds cool, but I just don't know about the logistics and the expense and how long it takes to get on site there. I just want people to feel like, hey, this is totally doable.
Yeah. Every year it sells out. They do something a little different than most races and more like a drive-in movie theater. It's you pay by the carload, right? Because at the end of the day, what limits the amount of spectators is parking, right? But I will say that they do an amazing job. This thing is like almost exclusively run by volunteers. There are people who, don't sleep, I'm sure, for 3 days getting this thing going. And so there are a couple of ways you can approach it. There are a couple schools of thought here. A lot of people want to get up there as early as possible. So you can't camp ahead. That's the other thing. You have to, and you can't get there too early because they close a gate until I think it's 1:30 in the morning or 2 in the morning, whatever it is. And then they open the gates, right? And then you can, again, choose to drive up a couple of miles to the start line, or you can go all the way to the top or any place in between. Really, the only thing that's limiting is where you can park. They do a wonderful job of running these shuttle buses. So I think a lot of people, they want to get their car up. They want to, have access to their stuff, and, people haul up coolers and all the other stuff, because there's not a lot in the way of like, food, or, there's not a lot of food trucks aren't a big part of this, right? There's kind of the basics. And so, people make a day of it. But
you have to be self-contained.
I don't know.
In other words.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd go out of my way to get there as early as we did this year. I think we could have probably gotten there a little later and been just fine. For us, there was really nothing to be gained by, I don't know, parking right at the starting line, because you can park at the bottom, take a bus. It's just as easy. They have these regular buses, these luxury coaches. Everything is so dialed in. It just seems as a spectator, it seems to run seamlessly. But to your point, if you want to plan ahead, you want to go to this thing, just know that it does sell out. The move is to share a car with several other people, right? Because I think you're paying by the car, right? Bring your own stuff, bring lots of sunscreen, bring layers. Like, this year was really warm. So we needed a jacket at the start, but by the end of the day, it was, 85 degrees, at least where we were. Bring lots of water, bring, whatever you want. And if you are beyond the starting line, know that you're not coming back down until every single car in a parade makes its way back down. So,
right. So you've got to really be provisioned. I mean, whatever food and drink and whatever else you need, sunscreen, aspirin, whatever it is, you got to hike it in. And so it's not like, say, the Isle of Man TT or the Mille Miglia, where you've got spectators all along the route kind of pressed up against the course and waiting for the next car to come through, or WRC. It's not like that, because the mountain is a little bit unforgiving. The terrain, I mean,
right.
There's like, you're going to be standing on a slope if you're, and there's also probably some safety considerations where you can't be like on the outside of a corner or something like that.
For sure. Every year at the media meeting, they make that very, very clear. There are some places you don't want to stand, like the outside of corners, right? It's pretty neat because you can get right up to the action at the same time, right? I think I guess I've never been, to a real like stage rally, but I envision it's a little like that. Mm-hmm. It's an A to B race, right? Mm-hmm. Or A to B, contest.
Right. Point to point.
Yeah. Say it like this. Right. So it's a little different. One of these years, I want to just really make it a funky adventure, go all the way up to Devil's Playground, which is this area we talked about before, where you can see lots of different turns. You can really, but that's a commitment. That's where it snows. That's where it hails. You're up so high, you're up at 14,000 feet and all that comes with it. No, that's the thing. And I think the rule of thumb is it's usually 20 or 25 degrees cooler from like starting line to finish, right? And think about that, how that affects the car and the driving dynamics and the tires and the way the engine runs and all that too. It's such a, and there's this spectacle of death, right? That kind of hangs over the whole thing. Again, know a couple of the drivers, and you want to go up and you want to kind of chum around with them before the race. And you forget, like, they're about to do something really, really dangerous here.
Oh yeah.
Right. they need to focus, like you can talk some other time, it is, it is a very dangerous thing with exposures and just, you've got to just be, I imagine, just so dialed in. So to your point, it is all these things. It's unique. There's nothing else like it. You've got all these variables, even as a spectator, that you've got to consider. I can't imagine, what that's like as a driver.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's psychologically part of why we find racing exciting, right? Is because of the inherent danger.
Yeah.
There have been 7 fatalities at Pikes Peak over the years, but that's over 100+ year stretch. Like you said, this was the 102nd running.
Yeah.
We don't like to think about that, but of course this is always, an inherently dangerous pursuit. But that's also why we have such a high regard for the people who take the risk, right?
Absolutely. And I suppose if you ran the numbers, it's probably much safer than many, if not most events, right? And it's so run. I know they do everything they possibly can to keep it safe and always have. I think, again, the inherent risks or challenges of the thing, the road can buckle. Right. The course that, the first guy's running versus what the last person is running, it's not the same course. Right. You mentioned the amount of turns, right? I mean, there must only be a handful of people that can memorize all those turns. Right.
Right.
And don't forget, this is a public road.
Yeah.
It's a toll road, but it's a public road. I think it's owned by the city of Colorado Springs or something who maintains it. And, again, this is just something racing is inherently dangerous. I think the folks at Pikes Peak do an amazing job of keeping this as safe as they possibly can. They're really strict about, keeping people off the track but yet, there can be a sheep or a deer, I mean, it's such a unique thing.
Right. By the way, you mentioned the Broadmoor. And I think we should give people a little bit of background there. The Broadmoor is a hotel, a luxury hotel in Colorado Springs that opened in 1918. And it was kind of one of these sort of palatial spots. And from the beginning of the motorized era, the Broadmoor has been taking guests on a sightseeing tour up Pikes Peak. And over the years, they've had many custom cars built specifically for the hotel to shuttle guests, most notably, and I think most prominently, Cadillacs over the years. So they've had these long stretch Cadillacs that can carry 16 or 20 passengers, and they have the roofs on the cars. They have windows in them for panoramic views. And those Broadmoor Cadillacs are highly collectible. There's a few out there, that still remain, and many in private hands. And I think the Broadmoor itself still owns a few of their historic cars. But kind of a cool side note, just in Pikes Peak history.
Yeah, they do. And there is a museum on site, right? That there's a Pikes Peak Hillclimb. And I just for the record, I got to get this right. It's the Broadmoor Pikes Peak International Hillclimb, brought to you by Gran Turismo. AKA the Race to the Clouds. So to your point, Broadmoor, I mean, this is just, this has been a part of the thing since the beginning. And there was this really interesting guy, and we could fill up a whole show about this, but Spencer Penrose was his name, who started this thing. He was an American entrepreneur. I think he was from the East Coast, somewhere, Philadelphia or something. And he came out and created this thing. And it is they don't build stuff like this anymore. Right?
No, they don't. No, they don't.
And everything about it, like you mentioned those custom cars, there are a handful of places in the country that do these kinds of things. Do you remember the movie Catch Me If You Can?
I sure do.
The airport, and they had these stretch, station wagons, or that's kind of what these vehicles are and were. And, I guess Cadillac a little more upscale, the sand dunes up in Michigan, they have these vehicles specially made. Is it Yellowstone that had these custom buses I love that kind of stuff. I just can nerd out on those custom bodied vehicles, but
yeah, those were white motor coaches. I've sat in one of those, and so Glacier National Park operates some still, and they've converted theirs to a modern chassis and drivetrain. But Yellowstone had those buses, Glacier had those buses. Super cool, but totally custom.
Yeah, so cool. And this guy, Spencer Penrose, I mean, he was kind of I saw a picture of him, kind of looked like Clark Gable or something. I mean, this was a different era. This place is of a different time. And the fact that they're still so involved that they underwrite the thing. And it's a beautiful place too. It's just, that might be the move. You come into town, you stay at the Broadmoor, right? I mean, Fairfield Inn is great where we were, but stay at the Broadmoor, spend the money, just do the whole thing, go to the museum, right? Soak in the history. They still have Spencer Penrose, I think it was his personal car, which was at Amelia with Fred Veach. I think it's a chopped down Packard. So it's like one of these old, big old 30s cars or whatever that has most of the middle taken out of it. So it would go up the mountain better. I mean, this stuff is there, that's the way to do it. Come in from out of town, stay there, do it right. Go to Porsche, Colorado Springs, go to the Fan Fest, get up early, watch the sunrise on the mountain, just take it all in.
Right. Ryan, before I let you go, let's talk about your latest project.
Yeah.
You were the former co-host of the Steering Committee podcast, which was a great show that I really enjoyed. And I was a little bit sad to see that go, but times change. There's a season for everything. And now you've got a new, so what's going on with you?
Yeah, sure. So, you mentioned the steering committee, and I'm so proud of what Doug Fogler and I did over 4.5 years. I think 185 episodes. It was one of those things, like a lot of things, just starts as an idea, as a hobby. You sit down, you have a few bourbons, then you feel like you can conquer the world. And next thing we knew, we had a show that people were listening to, and then it kind of turned into a little something more. And, it opened so many doors for us. We met so many neat people. The vast majority of the friends, the people I know, now are through that show, car people, and car people, the nicest people in the world, right? But after 185 episodes, it was just time to move on. We had this sort of thing we did where we'd sit down in person and just kind of like you're hanging out with friends in your garage. It's literally what we did, right? And it was wonderful, but it's time to move on. Things have a lifespan, and it had reached its lifespan, and so after that. Put that on the shelf. I was approached by a friend by the name of Alan Orchard, and Alan's a really neat guy because he's an automotive engineer, and he was on the Mercedes F1 team. He was on the McLaren F1 team. He worked for a little company called the Ascari. If you remember, if that means anything to you, remember that company?
Yes.
Made a supercar back in the day. And I had met him at Bruce Meyer's garage about a year ago when we were recording with Bruce Meyer. And Alan had brought in this team of folks from Rivian just to sort of, see Bruce's amazing collection and just, kind of, I don't know, just as a field trip, I guess. And, and Alan came up as we were packing up, and, he asked, about the show and stuff, and we kept in touch. And then, when I made the announcement about the steering committee coming to an end, he approached me about doing a project. And so we're calling it the Roadshow. We also have our friends, Dan Pilling, who is with 077 Media up in the Pacific Northwest, does a ton of work with Dirtfish, if you know Dirtfish. Also
Sure.
Lindsay Jesh, who's a car writer on the West Coast, who I think you've met. And so it's the four of us. Alan and I are the primary hosts, and then Alan and Dan will join us on some regularity. And we're in 4 different cities, so it's going to be a very different thing for us. I mentioned about sitting around a garage and having a few beers. This is over Riverside, which is this application we're using now. So it's a video thing. So you'll get to see us, for better or worse, finally. And I think we each bring something sort of unique to the table. Alan, obviously, having been on these F1 teams, back at McLaren, working on road cars, his experience, his F1 knowledge, Dan and Lindsay and everything that they've done. It's going to be a different blend. And I think it's going to be really neat. We sat down with Freddie Hunt yesterday. Freddie is the son of James Hunt, right? And had a really interesting conversation with him about his life, his father, what makes a legend, right? And so we are hoping to have that out very soon. Hopefully by the time you hear this, we'll have posted that show and be posting many more. So I'm very excited. When you work with 3 people who are so wonderful and who are bringing so much to the table, it's going to be fun.
No, I think this is great, Ryan. And you've got a great crew there. We had a little cocktail hour when you guys were out in LA to record a few episodes of the steering committee, the last few episodes, in fact. And we were all together. So, I was able to hang out with Alan and Lindsay and Dan, and what a great team. And Doug is off to his own endeavors, and we wish him well, of course, too. But you guys are launching early July, so people can look for the Roadshow on their favorite podcast app. And I definitely encourage my listeners to add that to their quiver, because I think it'll be great. And Freddie Hunt, I mean, the son of James Hunt. Wow, what a get.
Yeah, he's a neat guy, nice guy, interesting guy, and you can only imagine the life that he's led, right? There was a polo playing chapter, if that tells you.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's the first for a guest of mine. So, but we had such a good time with you out in LA, Maurice, and I look forward to working with you, in the future, collaborating with you again. You're just such a pro, right, from beginning to end. So Horsepower Heritage doesn't get much better.
Thank you, my friend. I really, truly appreciate that. And I try to stay humble, man. But I also love just the community atmosphere of all of this, and you're a part of that. And so anyway, kumbaya.
There you go.
All right, guys, listen, you can catch up with Ryan on Instagram at Ryan Bahrke. That's Bahrke. And look for the Roadshow. And you guys have a new Instagram page for the Roadshow, right?
We do. It's the Roadshow Podcast.
Roadshow
Podcast. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. So people check that out. And that is our Pikes Peak 2024 report. And Ryan, I'm happy to plug your new efforts. Good luck to you. Coming up, guys, stay with me because I've got Dr. Gerald Alexander, and we're going to be talking vintage coach built and competition Ferraris and Alfa Romeos and all kinds of cool stuff. So stick with me. That's coming up right after this. Hi guys, Maurice Merrick here, and I want to let you know about 3 great scale models available right now at modelcitizendiecast.com. First, there's the pocket-size Lancia Stratos HF Stradale in 1/64th scale by Mini GT. Or how about a BMW 3.0 CS Coupe in 1/43rd scale by Mini Champs in your choice of 3 different colors. Or if American muscle is more your style, how about the 1968 Shelby GT500 convertible in great big 1/18th scale by Acme Trading Company. It's finished in Acapulco blue with white racing stripes, and boy oh boy, check out those mag wheels. You can find all of these and more at modelcitizendiecast.com. Use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout and get 10% off your order. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars.
Gerald, what a pleasure to be here at your collection. Incredible cars, and I'm really excited to hear about how it all came to be. So thanks for having us in.
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people, I always liked cars when I was young and always liked vintage cars in particular, but never really could figure out if I had a collection, how I could use it and have it nearby. And I think I was actually influenced quite a bit by the Ferris Bueller movie. I was about 19 years old when that movie came out, and I was similar age to the people, frankly, in the movie acting. And, when the person in the movie said, I highly encourage you to consider getting a vintage Ferrari if you have the means, I just thought, wow, why wouldn't you? And so I always thought about it. I had a roommate in college who restored old cars, and I always thought about getting one. And my first vintage car was a 280 SL Mercedes, which I drove for several years. But eventually, I was able to pick up my first Ferrari and fell in love with it, and I kept finding other Ferraris in the 50s and 60s, and it was just something that I researched it, I learned more about it. It was something that I really just had a passion for. And over the years I've looked at other cars too. I have an old Aston Martin, I have an old Bugatti, I have an old Alfa Romeo, so certainly it's not just Ferraris, but somehow Ferraris just had a certain look and feel and sound and even smell to them, and it was something that really got me excited.
Yeah, Ferraris are production cars, but they're very low production cars relative to other classics. I think that's really special. I think the variety of coach work on Ferraris is incredible too. Your collection is a driving collection too. I think that's really important. Far too many cars sit unused.
Yeah, and that's part of why I tried to incorporate the garage into my house, because I really wanted to use them on a regular basis. It's not good for the cars to sit too long, and even though they look great, really driving them is what they're made for. And so, I try and rotate them on a regular basis so no one sits too long, and they all have a personality to them. These cars are not all the same. Even within a series of cars, they're all a little bit different. And when you talk about the early 50s Ferraris being often Vignale-bodied cars, and then the later ones by Scaglietti or Pininfarina. They're all different feel and different style, and it's really nice to see the nuance between them.
Yeah, there's a lot of differences in, if you look closely and carefully, you can see construction methods. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, some of these cars even have more of a feminine look or feel. Some are more masculine and aggressive. You know, some of the race cars are very light and nimble, whereas some of the road cars are more luxurious. So they all have a little bit of a different feel and look to them, but you can see the common lines and the common themes.
Right. Well, let's talk about some of the cars. So your oldest Ferrari is the 225S, is that right?
Yes. So that car is a Vignale-bodied car, which is a little bit different than the later Ferraris in that it's quite round, it's quite basic, but I love it. The fact that it's so light, and the fact that, you know, when you're out there driving it, it feels almost like a motorcycle where it's just wind and air, and it's a lot of fun. It was a car that has a unique provenance because it was owned by Froilan Gonzalez, who was an early, of course, race car driver for Enzo Ferrari. And he was from South America, and he was one of the people that won first at Silverstone in '51, I believe. And so the fact that it was his personal car, I have his old helmet, his old trophies, so it's fun to have some of his old stuff with the car.
What year is the 225?
52.
52, okay. Yeah, so very early in Ferrari's history as a manufacturer. So incredible, though, that right out of the gate they were highly competitive and winning races.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Enzo Ferrari, I mean, people that knew him said that he was certainly passionate, but he was also someone that wanted to win and pushed his drivers hard. But, you know, I think that most successful people are driven like that. And so my understanding, and this is maybe just rumor, is that during that period of time, Enzo Ferrari wasn't doing great financially, and he was struggling. And sometimes when he couldn't really pay his race car drivers, he would sometimes give them a car as opposed to actually paying their salary. So that was the rumor with this car.
I've heard that before. I mean, Enzo was building road cars to support his racing habit. That was true of the entire history of the company.
Sure, yeah, and I don't really even think he enjoyed those cars as much as the race cars, but what choice did he have? He had to support the race team, and that's how he supported it. So fortunately, everyone else loved his road cars, and that, you know, brought in the revenue.
I wonder if that had anything to do with his rebuffing Ferruccio Lamborghini, almost like, I really don't care about the road cars, go away.
Yeah, that might be. I mean, it's a funny story, the rivalry, you know, and I think competition is good in any field, including cars. But you're probably right that because he was making road cars as opposed to race cars, I don't think he truly saw it as a rivalry.
Yeah.
Not the way Lamborghini saw it.
Right. How do you start building a collection?
Yeah, I mean, it's the old saying, I think you should just get what you enjoy and what you like. And for me, like a lot of people, it's the cars you look toward when you were young, what are hanging on your wall, the posters you had. I remember even the little Matchbox cars. I had a Ferrari 250 LM. I remember sitting on my desk, and to this day, that car just, whenever I see a photo of one, I just think, wow, what a car. And so for me, it was not just Ferraris of the 60s, but other cars of that era too. It's just that Ferraris had a special place for me because they just weren't into racing and road cars and sports cars, but they also made very elegant cars. So I just really thought they checked all the boxes.
It's amazing too how many iterations of a given model there are. You know, the 250 series comes to mind immediately, of course, but and then there are the 275s, 330. They just got a lot out of every chassis and drivetrain.
Yeah, and it's fun to see the difference between them because the 250, of course, was a long run. I think it was 52 to 64, so 12 years. And some of the later cars in that run, I have some like the Lusso, I think was the very last model of the 250. And to compare it to the very next year when the 275s came out, like I have a GTB and a GTS, they're now a 5-speed instead of a 4-speed. They have, of course, a 10% larger engine, and you can feel the difference in torque and horsepower. So, and it feels a little bit more like a modern car. You know, there's more conveniences. And so it's fun to see how things change over time. Also, they went from the boot to the gated shifters. So it's fun to have these 5-speed gated shifters, but you have to pay attention when you're getting into the car because they're all different. And where, reverse is in one, is first in another, or second in another. So you have to pay attention. You have to know the cars personally. I even have a Buono from 57 where it's got a backwards gearbox. And so you shift toward yourself. So you really have to pay attention which car you're getting into.
Yeah, interesting. Now, your collection is a driving collection, which I really admire because too many cars get put away and never used. And I know that's important to you.
Yeah, it is. So, we try and take them out every week. And my rule of thumb is I try not to have a given car sit for more than about 6 weeks, because in my experience, that's when things start, not just the batteries, but the fuel lines and all sorts of things start, the carburetors not functioning properly. And so I think if you drive a car every 4 to 6 weeks, that's what it's meant to be, on the road and out there driving, and it just functions better. It starts, it runs well, and I find I don't have to tinker with them or repair them as much if I have that kind of a rotation.
Which car would you say is probably the most fun to drive sort of in everyday conditions? Because we're not always lucky to have open roads and winding roads and so forth. So in traffic, out of all your classics, which is probably the...
Yeah, that's a good question, because when people ask me, what's your favorite car? And I often say, it's like asking a parent, who's your favorite child? How do you answer that question? But for me, for cars, I would say, how far are we going and what's the weather? Because if you have a nice sunny day with 80 degrees, the open top cars are a lot of fun. But if it's raining or cold, they're not much fun. Sometimes when we take them out early in the morning and the sun hasn't come up yet, you really have to bundle up. I grew up in Canada, so I call it a toque. You might call it a ski hat, but you really have to start bundling up to take these cars out at dawn. And if you're driving it on a regular daily basis, you want something that's a little more comfortable, not quite maybe as quick or as sporty, but something that's smooth and luxurious. And so I think of something like my 1965 Aston Martin DB5. It's what they call a gentleman's grand touring car. And I agree with that, because it has power windows, it has a nice radio. Even though it's a 65, it feels very civilized for that era. And you can go over a speed bump and you don't feel like you're, doing a lot of work to drive the car. So you can spend hours in it and it doesn't wear you out. Whereas it may not be as fun as some of the sportier cars, but it's very comfortable.
Yeah, that's a car that was really designed to take to continental Europe, do many hours, a lot of mileage, from mountain passes to the plains of Central Europe. So yeah, it's a continent crusher. Yeah, that's what I like to say about those cars.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that even though a car like my 58 Tour de France is clearly a car that can go many miles and was great through all the hills of France, it's not exactly a comfortable car to spend time in, because it is very stiff and it's very quick and it's very loud, and so it's fun, but it'll wear you down.
I'm glad you mentioned the Tour de France. It's got quite a bit longer wheelbase than other competition sports cars. How does the handling compare to maybe a shorter wheelbase car that you've driven or that you own?
Yeah, it's definitely different. Ferrari transitioned from their long wheelbase in the late 50s to their short wheelbase in the early 60s. And they also transitioned from drum brakes to disc brakes. And you can see the difference. One certainly feels like a more modern car and it performs a little better. But part of the fun of these cars is the fact that they don't always feel like a modern car. So I think it's a blast to take out a car like that has drum brakes and isn't maybe balanced perfectly, because it makes you think around corners and where to start slowing down. And so I think it's very interactive, and it takes you to an era that isn't modern, which is part of the fun.
Let's talk about that little Alfa that you have. It's a little Alfa Coupe. And it's a 1950, right? 1950.
It's quite unique because Ghia only bodied 4 of those. And so every one of them was also unique. So it's a 1 of 4 or it's a 1 of 1, depending on how you count. But it was a car that I saw kind of made the rounds at Pebble Beach and Villa d'Este and all these great shows and was winning awards. And but as people tend to do when they restore these fine cars and win their awards, they move on to restoring other fine cars. So I was able to get it last year at Pebble Beach, and it's really an elegant design. It's quite a unique design because most Alfa Romeos are small cars, and this is a fairly sizable car. Big wheels, big stance, and so it certainly has a presence to it when you show up. And people always ask, "What is this?" I don't understand what this car is.
Is that a 3-liter?
Yeah, and it's a car that really has other components that other cars mimicked, but because Ghia bodied it, it looks different than everything else. And so it's just a unique car.
I think it's also sort of ahead of its time styling-wise. It looks like a much newer car than 1950.
Yeah, it does. And I think a lot of later models they made had some of those cues. But, I think it almost, when you look at the dash of it, harkens back to almost an Art Deco kind of era also. We think of the 30s being Art Deco, but, there were trailing style that kept on for a few decades, and you see that in the Ghia.
Yeah. Your car collection is Italian heavy, let's say. Any particular reason for that other than just personal taste or...
I think that it's my personal taste, but I like elegant cars, stylish cars, and, it just catches my eye. It's not that I have anything against German cars or English cars. I love plenty of those also, but I think just the style of Italian cars is quite unique.
They are beautiful, and so many different coach builders. And you mentioned Vignale. Vignale could be very flamboyant. Scaglietti, always very athletic. They each have their own flavor, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the fun, of looking at these old Ferraris. It wasn't just Enzo Ferrari designing these cars. I mean, he was almost like, a general contractor building a house. You have all these subcontractors that you dole things out to. And really, they deserve a lot of credit because these cars, the styling of them is unique partly on who you choose to do the coach work. And so Scaglietti's cars were certainly quite aggressive, and I would call them more masculine, for example, than Pininfarina's cars, which in my eye look a little more feminine. So even though they all are Ferraris, they have a different personality.
Did you happen to see the Superfast that won the Quail?
Yeah.
What a car.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's great about that era of cars is that, you go to these different shows and you see these low numbers cars that were produced and they have such a different style to them and, they're all unique in their own ways. So it's a lot of fun going to those shows. I've only been to the Quail a few times, but we try to go to Pebble every year and that's part of the fun. You never know what cars are going to show up.
And you learn a lot.
You do.
Well, I have always said it's like an open air pop-up car museum. And you may never see some of those cars again in your lifetime in public.
Oh, that's very true. And as a golfer, it's a special spot to be on the 18th hole because when I'm looking at these great vintage cars, I remember, hey, this is where I hit my 4-iron from. And when I'm golfing on the 18th hole, I remember, hey, this is where I saw that short wheelbase Ferrari. So it's just a special spot for anyone who loves cars or golf.
It is. And you also, in addition to the cars, you run into fantastic people in the industry, designers, engineers, racing drivers. You just never know who you're going to meet. Any brushes with greatness at Pebble Beach for you?
Well, yeah, you certainly run into interesting people, both in the car industry who are former race car drivers or just enthusiasts. But, you talk about the challenge sometimes people have there. Ferrari had one of their current drivers standing in front of their new car, which they don't call an SUV.
Puro Sangue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They call it, I think, a grand touring car. But his whole job, I think, was to convince everyone that it's not an SUV. So I thought he had a very tough job that day.
That's a difficult job. What do you think of it?
I think it's fine. I think it's a good-looking vehicle. I just think that it's controversial because no one really ever thought Ferrari would go down that path. Mm-hmm. And so, I understand that if there's a market, why would you not? But, it's controversy.
Yeah, but I seem to recall quite a bit of uproar when the Porsche Cayenne was announced. I mean, it's the same thing.
It is.
And the market reality is that if you want to stay in business, you have to be in that market segment.
Yeah, you do. And so I sympathize, but at the same time, as someone who likes tradition, I'm not sure I necessarily agree.
Yeah. Another little difference in flavor inside your collection is there's a couple of pre-war cars, just 2 pre-war cars. One is an Austin 7 based little roadster, right?
Yes.
And then the other is a 28 Bugatti?
A 1927 Bugatti.
27, okay.
So it's a Type 38A. It's bodied by Figoni, supposedly the first ever Figoni-bodied Bugatti before he got together with Falaschi. And so it was sort of a bucket list thing for me to have that on the lawn at Pebble last year because, you always go to Pebble and visit, but unless you have the right type of car, And so for me, that was the kind of car I could take to Pebble Beach or take to some of the events that are pre-war. And I mean, Bugatti, it goes without saying that it's an amazing company, an amazing family, an amazing history. Part of it's tragic, what happened with the Second World War and, their company having struggles, but, their designs and their feats both in racing and styling were amazing. So having a Bugatti to me was something that I just needed or wanted in the collection.
And what's it like to drive?
It's really actually pretty good for a car that old. It has enough power. It feels like it's stable on the road. Those cars are fairly large compared to a modern car. So, they do feel like they're solid. And, I have friends, for example, with Silver Ghosts who, drive them all over the place and have no problem at all. So if a car of that era is built properly, they're surprisingly reliable and they feel good.
Crash box transmission in the Bugatti?
Yeah.
And so you're going to grind gears once in a while. It just comes with the territory.
Yeah, and I'm still learning. The double clutching, it's not something I grew up doing, so I have to learn how to drive these cars, but that's part of the fun.
It just goes to show how skilled the racing drivers were at the time. The cars are pretty unforgiving.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, now we went and watched the new Formula One in Vegas recently, and it was a lot of fun. My kids love it, but it's different than it was years ago. You're not necessarily taking your life in your hands like you were then, and in some ways the skill set was different back then. I mean, you really had to pay attention to certain things, and it was a different way of driving.
Yeah. A couple of Italian cars I noticed that are absent from your collection. I don't see any Lancias, and I don't see any Lamborghinis.
Well, I would say the Lancia is not by choice because there's plenty of them I enjoy and have my eye on. So that might be a temporary issue. Lamborghini, it's not that I dislike the cars. I think it's just that everyone has their own personality and style. And to me, I like the older Lamborghinis more than the newer ones, but there's not many cars I can't say that of. And I just think that Lamborghini tends to be quite aggressive, quite low, and maybe not as comfortable as some cars. So, it's funny because I almost bought a Porsche 904 years ago until I sat in it. And I got down in it with the 5-point restraint, and you're sitting right on the floorboard. And I thought, wow, this is really a race car. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable driving this on a regular basis. And so that helped me decide maybe not to pick it up. And I think just Lamborghinis fall into that sort of category.
It's disappointing when you finally get a chance to sit in a car that you've really admired for years and you realize you don't fit or it's uncomfortable. I've had that experience.
Yeah, and sometimes it's also how it looks to you. I think the reason I didn't get the 904 is it was sitting right beside a car I just loved more, which was a short wheelbase Berlinetta Ferrari. And so the two side by side, I just couldn't go for that one when I saw the other one beside it. So It changed my impression.
I can relate to that. When you buy cars, is it primarily at auction or do you try to do private party sales whenever possible? I mean, everyone likes to save a few bucks, right? Let's be honest.
Yeah, it's some of both. I mean, it's just really where I can find the cars on the market. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about the internet today is you don't necessarily have to hunt on foot like you did years ago, or you maybe don't need the connections you once did. But, I would say for me, it's been about half and half. So I love going to auctions, the excitement, the fun. It's always nice to see what's crossing the block. But, sometimes also you can't really vet the cars as well at auction. So if you have someone reliable you're buying a car from, there may be more confidence in what you're getting. So, I've done a little of both over the years. One of my cars, I got the 275 GTS, was from England, from a well-known Ferrari guy, John Collins. So he's been around a long time, and, he certainly is someone who always has top quality cars. So it's nice to get a vehicle from someone like him.
Incidentally, what's the difference between the 275 GTB and the GTS? Is the GTS the competition version? Is that
the GTS is the Spider, the convertible?
Oh, of course.
So they had the same engine, right. They had the same drivetrain. However, they look completely different, and often people don't even know they're the same car. So, it's funny how aggressive the GTB looks, whereas the GTS is a little more of a cruising, understated car. And I think compared to something like a Cal Spider, which is again more aggressive looking, I would call the GTS more of a stealth Ferrari. You often show up in it and people don't know it's a Ferrari.
Gotcha. Makes sense. I'm surprised that I don't see a Ferrari Daytona in your collection, but maybe there's a year cutoff for you? Is that?
I don't think it's purely based on the year cutoff, although everyone knows what happened in the early 70s. I mean, because of OPEC and because of the DOT and all the regulations with safety and bumpers, I mean, car design certainly took a hit, as did, I would say, performance. So really everything changed in the early 70s, and I think, to me at least, those changes weren't positive. So I preferred the cars until that era, and maybe to me, just once I start seeing the cars of the 70s, they just aren't the same for at least my eye.
Does that mean then also that you're not really a huge fan of like Marcello Gandini and the wedge cars? And
I guess I'm not, and it's not that I have anything against them. It's just not quite what I get enthusiastic about.
Sure. Yeah. It's all very subjective and individualized, isn't it? I mean, I just think that some of the early 70s designs, just how outlandish and futuristic they became, and kind of threw all practicality aside.
Yeah.
And even just sacrificed comfort and ergonomics and drivability for that, purely just for the look.
Yeah, but no, I think there's truth to that, and I think that something like a Lamborghini Countach is a wild style that certainly makes an entrance, but it was never something I really felt comfortable in or suited me.
And I think a lot of those designs were just highly exploratory. I think a lot of manufacturers really struggled coming out of the 60s. Where do we go from here? Especially with, materials were changing. Plastics were really coming in. Regulations were changing worldwide on the manufacture of cars. So it was a transitional period.
Sure. And I mean, certainly the cars got safer. They got more efficient. I mean, all those things were positives. But if you're a purist who has a look for tradition, it just wasn't something that appealed to me. I think the fact that you get in an old car that doesn't have a seatbelt and that you can smell that you're getting, 5 miles a gallon, and those are things that I think are fun.
Yeah, smell that you're getting 5.
Yeah, you can tell.
I love it. It is true. It is true that rich, like that heavy scent of unburnt gasoline.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel sorry sometimes for the person behind me at a stoplight. I mean, because you can tell, it's running rich and you can smell it.
Isn't it amazing though? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that idling at a traffic signal, you would just smell everyone's exhaust, and it was strong.
Sure.
We've come a long way in a short period of time.
Sure. No, and I think that's mostly a positive, but one of the challenges of having old cars like I have is the modern fuel. So for example, I have to hunt around for racing fuel that's high octane or doesn't have the ethanol in it. And even then, probably I should be adding lead. I mean, I can't say that in California, but I know guys who find it somehow because it's just not good for these old cars.
Right.
So I know some guys who try and pick up aviation fuel. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, the fuels now they actually are dissolving the internals of carburetors and so forth, and then they leave all these deposits, which goes back to what you were talking about is you don't want to leave a car sitting for more than 6 weeks. You got to exercise them, then otherwise you do start to have problems. For sure.
Yeah, the fuel goes bad, and the fuel you're starting with already isn't as good for the car as it once was.
Yeah. Getting back to driving, you like to tour your cars as well. You like to take long trips.
I would say I like to take medium trips. I don't do a lot of the really long trips that some people do, but I like to take them out on a regular basis and run up and down the coast. So I think it's fun to take them on trips where I'm still close enough to home that if something goes wrong, I have an infrastructure, I have help. I'm maybe not as brave as some people.
But coming up, you're going to be doing a fairly long, although well-supported journey, which is the Mille Miglia, right?
Yeah, I hope to be. I've got one car, my 1957 Ferrari Buono, that when I bought that car, I had in mind potentially doing that rally because it qualifies. It's old enough that it qualifies. But I'm also right now looking at getting another car, an Alfa Romeo that's a 56 that would also qualify. So I'm going to see whether I like a little bit bigger car, a little bit smaller car to do it in, and hopefully I'll do it sometime soon.
And who's your co-driver going to be?
Well, that's to be determined. It's probably my son, who's 22 years old. So I think he's going to be the brave one that does it with me. But hopefully my wife and daughter will come out just to be our, cheerleader squad to at least meet us as we do it.
That'd be great. Does your wife enjoy riding in the cars?
Some. I mean, she certainly doesn't have the passion for it that I do, but she's been a great supporter, and she gives me free rein and says, if that's what you like, go do it. So it's great that she gives me the freedom to enjoy it.
That's terrific. What stones are yet unturned for you? What's next for the collection?
Yeah, I think that I'm trying to force myself to get out of my comfort zone, because early on I would have just bought all Ferraris in the 50s and 60s. I mean, just limited to that. So I almost have to force myself to get a pre-war Bugatti and to get an Aston Martin and to get something else over here. So it's fun now to look at other car makers and figure out what not just pros and cons they had, but sometimes unique things you didn't know about. And so I think I don't have a Porsche, and I've always enjoyed the 550 Spider. I always thought that was a great car. And so I think that that's certainly something I still have my eye on. Or
maybe an RS60 even. That would be...
Maybe, yeah. I think even more unique in some ways.
Yeah. That's why I mentioned it, because, the thing is, if you have a 550, most people will think it's a replica.
Right.
And a lot of people don't know about the RS60. It's a fairly obscure car.
Yeah.
Unless you're talking to, real enthusiasts.
I think there's truth to that. A lot of people know the 550 Spider, and frankly, most of them on the road aren't real. I think that the same really applies to a Shelby Cobra. Everyone knows the car, but not all of them are real. So if you have something more unique like a Ciata, people don't know it well enough to go out and start making ones that aren't real. So maybe there's truth to getting something a little more unique.
Yeah, or an Auto Vu.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Yeah, the list goes on and on. Very, very interesting stuff to consider. Lancia Aurelia, is that a car that's interesting?
Sure. Oh, yeah. And speaking about an Auto Vu, I looked at one not long ago, and that was another car that when I got inside of it and actually sat inside, I didn't realize that they're a pretty compact car. They're not a large car. And so depending on if it's a Zagato or depending on, which exact kind, they're interesting, great cars, but they're from an era where they were quite small. So, you get inside and you kind of feel a little bit almost claustrophobic.
The 70 Mercedes-Benz SL, would you say that's the car that if you need to just not worry about traffic and just kind of drive leisurely, is that the car that you jump in?
That's probably true. It's a very comfortable car. It's a car that is both vintage and modern, and it's sporty yet it's luxurious. So I think it's a really nice car that is a balance between those extremes, and I really enjoy the car. It's also what I would call an affordable classic. It was my first vintage car, and I think that people always think, well, I can't really get into car collecting because it's this price point, or, it's expensive, which really isn't true. There's all different levels of collecting, and so I think because they made so many of them is what makes it affordable. It's not because it isn't a great car. It just doesn't have the rarity of some other cars. But sometimes the reason cars are rare is they weren't popular in period. Whereas a car like the 280 SL was loved even in period, so they sold thousands of them.
Yeah, and they're so elegant. Credit to Paul Brock for that design. Fantastic. Quite a bit of longevity there for that car.
Yeah, I mean, that car, I think, has never had a period where it fell out of favor. That's not true of a lot of other cars. You look at cars like the Daytona or the Dino, there were different periods of time where people said, this is a better car than that, and it changes over time. But a car like the 280 SL, I think every decade since it was produced, it was always a popular car that people loved.
And then there are other cars that you kind of wonder, like the Porsche 914. Who would have ever thought that 914s would be worth what they are now? But a rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also that times change. For example, the cars my son and his friends are interested in are different than the cars I'm interested in, And so even though they may not be things that you have an eye for, others do, and trends change.
Now, the Jaguar E-Type, Enzo Ferrari called it the most beautiful car he'd ever seen. And yet, it's not in your garage.
It's not. And, I think it is a beautiful car. But to me, the balance in styling between masculine and feminine, I think, is a balance. And when a car gets too rugged and masculine, I don't quite appreciate the muscle cars as much as some people, because that to me is one extreme. And to me, the XKE is maybe on the feminine extreme. It's very stylish, so much so that, I feel like maybe it's not just for me.
Right.
That's how I see it.
Would that be true of the D-Type for you as well? Is that too much on the feminine side?
I think the D-Type is actually a pretty aggressive styled car, and I think the D-Type is just something that is fast and is maybe not very comfortable. And if I was someone who was collecting maybe more of a race car collection, that would fit in very nicely. But I really have more of a road car collection, with the exception of one or two. They're mostly road cars. And so, but I think that's a great car.
Right. By the way, what kind of reactions do you get from people in public who maybe aren't sure what they're looking at when you pull up to the gas station or into a parking lot?
Yeah, I think it's fun actually going over to where they sell the high octane fuel, because you sometimes bump into other car enthusiasts, but you also bump into people on the next pump that are just, wondering what that is. And it's often really fun because people don't necessarily know what it is, even though they'll see the badge, they'll see Ferrari, and, to talk to them just briefly about it, you can tell that you're opening them up to a world that they're not familiar with. And I think that it piques their interest.
I think it's interesting is that oftentimes people get the year wrong or even the era wrong. They think a car is much newer than it might be. And everything looks the same now. So having distinctive styling, in my opinion, is really a thing of the past.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, I think it is not all the blame of the car companies. It's partly the regulations, etc. But back then, they really had a personality and a style to a car. And so I think it was a bygone era. So that's what I like about it.
Yeah, definitely. Regulations they now dictate door height, window size, everything, you name it. As values have soared on these cars, popularity has risen. There's a finite number of these cars. Inevitably, there are continuation cars. There are revivals. There are, let's say, replicas. Is that of interest to you at all?
I would say maybe. I think it's a nod to how great these cars are that people are now starting to produce modern versions of them. I think it's almost an admission by the car makers that these were great years, these were great styles, and we didn't always make things better just because they're newer. So I think if there's a market for it, that's great.
One that springs to mind for me is the Aston Martin DB4 GT Zagato, of which only 25 were ever built in period. So it's an unobtainium car for most collectors, even if they have money to burn.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great car, obviously, but there's so few of them, they're very expensive. And so, I mean, I think that's a great car. When I was at the Goodwood Revival a few years ago, to see one, racing at 160 miles an hour was just astounding. Not just that it's so unique and so special, but you worry a little bit about them crashing it because there's so few of them around.
Yeah, tell me more about your Goodwood trip.
Yeah, so I did that a few years ago, and it was funny because it was raining and it was a little chilly, but the announcer said, we have a saying here in England that there's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate attire. So he didn't have a lot of sympathy for us that had underdressed. But it was great because you can walk around the entire track if you spend time, and you can, take your time at different corners and really see not just the speed of these cars on the straightaway, but how even cars of a certain era handled quite nicely. And so I thought it was just a blast. It was really fun.
I love seeing the battles between, let's say, the big Ford Galaxies and the much smaller, like Cortinas and so forth.
Sure.
That's really fun.
Yeah, and you see them the way they position themselves, that some of the smaller, lighter, less powerful cars might get passed on the straightaway, but they're going the same speed around the corners, and overall they're keeping up. It's really fun to watch.
It's wonderful. Of the cars in your collection, which was the most gratifying when you finally sat in it and drove it and were really just blown away? And then which car was the most disappointing?
That's interesting. I would say that one that was gratifying is surprising because it's an unloved Ferrari. It's the Buono. I have a 1957 250 GT Buono, and it was Ferrari's first high production car. They made about 55 of them. And they actually finished the series with Elena, which was the high roof versus the low roof. But it's unloved because its styling is understated. A lot of people from a distance don't even know it's a Ferrari. But the thing I loved about it, getting into it and driving it, is as opposed to the later 60s Ferraris, it's more nimble and lighter. And so I found that actually it's got the same, 250, which is a 12-cylinder 3-liter as the other cars, but the fact that it's quite light, it actually was really fun to drive. And the fact that it's got a solid 4-speed, the fact that it is something that really feels good on the road, even the drum brakes work just fine. So I enjoy the car. That's the reason why I'm tempted to take that one on the Mille Miglia, because I think it would do just fine. As far as cars I'm disappointed with, I loved the styling of the 275 GTB, and I got it in fly yellow, so it really makes an entrance when you show up with that car. People love the styling, they love the color, they say the color suits that style, which it does. But because I'm slightly over 6 feet tall, getting in that car is uncomfortable to drive because you have to lean down, your head's hitting the top. It's got a big wheel before power steering, which hits you in the leg. And because it's a 5-speed, first gear is right against your legs. So between the wheel and the shifter and the roof, you feel like it's not a very comfortable car to drive. So even though I love the styling of it, and it's a powerful car and it's a sporty car, it's not a comfortable car.
Very successfully raced, though.
Sure.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love the car. I just don't love it for more than about half an hour.
Right. Imagine doing Daytona in that car.
Right. So that's why I ask, which car are we taking? How far are we going? Because I love the car for short drives.
Right.
I don't love it for a long drive.
Right. If you had to pick one vintage Ferrari, you had to get rid of everything else, which one would it be?
Well, my first reflex is the model car I had as a kid, which is the 250 LM. But from everything I've been told about it, don't pick it because it's loud. It's, very uncomfortable to drive. Your feet go together because of the wheel wells. So everyone tells me it's like the 275, but even worse. So I guess even though that's the car I would love to get, I probably shouldn't get it because it's not very comfortable. I would say probably the car then I would get, and this is always hard. I mean, what would you really get? I would say something like a TDF that's maybe a Zagato. I love the TDF I have. It's a 3-louver and it's a very unique, interesting car. But the 5 they made that are by Zagato, I think are just drop dead gorgeous. They're amazing cars. They're very unique. Each one is special. So for me, that would probably be the car I would get.
Well, Gerald, thank you so much for having me in today. And I love hearing about the cars. I love looking at the cars. And I love that you're driving the cars.
Well, thank you. Great talking with you and enjoyed it.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Don't forget to leave me 5 stars and a quick review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you want to support the show with a donation, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. There's also the Instagram page and the YouTube channel. Lots of great videos for you over there. And I will see you back here on Wednesday, July 17th for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.